I might play it through the projector then, because it's just more convenient for people to look.
There's no sound. The sound isn't working.
No, but I'll just play it.
Okay, yeah, then come over here. That's fine. So we're gonna play. I'll start, and then when I'm done my intro, we'll go to his, and then I'll connect it back up for the end.
And then we'll have to cut out the video.
How do we cut out the video? Can't you just run in the background?
No, my point is like the video he's going to show is going to be on your video then.
Oh, right. Yeah, so maybe just turn that.
Okay.
Or something. Yeah, turn it.
I'll figure it. Okay,
Yeah.
I'll just...
Do something. You got a PhD. Or you work at MIT. I'm sure you can figure that out.
I'll be able to hold my hand in front of it.
It's also actually the so one of the issues because the image and the sound is identified and so somehow we have to
He's going to block it and turn it around, so it's not, none of the video will be shown on the audio.
and somehow the audio has to be
Where we were. Audio anymore.
It'll be played off.
Oh, okay.
You know what? It's
When before it goes, before I do anything with it, I'll edit it.
okay. That would be
I'll just press the audio. And I'll make sure that it doesn't get out.
Thanks.
Yeah. So here's what I have as your bio.
And you done my work?
Oh,
wow. That's good then.
Yeah.
So can you just full screen yours when we should try to plug it in here to see if that's how it's working. Shall I move it just through the hot switching?
I'll talk to it. Yeah, he was on my end.
Yeah, I'm just working out.
Did he help?
Okay. Hi, everybody. It's 6 o'clock, so we'll get started. We know there are quite a number of people who are still in transit trying to find out where this place is, so they'll come in when they come in, but we'll get started anyway. So my name is Laura Fisher. You all received emails from me. I'm the organizer of the Civic series. And I started the Civic series this May because I just felt like there were so many things going on in the world that I wanted to know about, and I just, like, the news was not sufficient. And I didn't have anyone to talk to about it. I felt kind of dumb talking with my friends, like not even knowing anything about what was going on. You know, like we had the last one was on Israel-Palestine. And I'm like, okay, someone really needs to define what a Palestinian is. So I'm not even 100% sure what a Palestinian is. It's like that level of understanding about these issues. So I started the Civic series, and we're a set of regular events, each one's dedicated to international and domestic issues that are of public importance for people like you to ask your questions and to understand and to be able to engage in a conversation So that's what we're here for here today. And so what it's gonna look like, is I'm gonna go over some ground rules that we established. We've had a couple of these, and we just have some basic rules to make sure the event goes really well. And then I'm going to introduce Bruce. And Bruce is going to give a presentation overview. He's going to show a short video, and then he's going to give a presentation. And then we'll open it up to questions and conversation afterwards. And we have to be out of here by 7:45, so we'll go until then. Okay? All right, cool. So, yes, there we go. So, great. So we have a few ground rules. So the intention of the Civic series is to help people understand the context behind current events. So our 4 ground rules, first one is to be curious and be open. Know that sometimes when we delve into issues like this, they actually get more confusing rather than less confusing. And so we're not really searching for truth here. We're just trying to understand these issues and what the background is and what the different sides of the story are. So again, I invite you to be curious and to be open. The second is there are no dumb questions. I had to ask what a Palestinian was in the last Civic series. So if you have a question, I'm sure other people in the audience in this group do as well. So I invite you just to feel really comfortable in asking whatever questions that you want to ask. Also, we're here to discuss issues, but not debate issues. So debating is fine. It's just not what the Civic series is about. So invite you to come with an open mind. And if you want to debate an issue back and forth, you're welcome to do that. But please do that in the session and not during this session. This session is about understanding what's going on in this realm. And so the last one is to ask for understanding. So you may disagree with people here, and you probably do, because a lot of people come from a lot of different backgrounds, and these are difficult issues. And so I invite you to ask for understanding. Ask why somebody said something the way that they did, so that we can understand both sides of the issue. Because if we can't come from understanding, how can we ask other people to do that as well? So those are the ground rules. Does everybody agree to the ground rules? Does anybody not agree to the ground rules? Okay, I think with this group we'll be okay. We've had some other groups that, the ground rules are very much needed. Some Civic Series veterans will know what I'm talking about. So great. So we'll move forward. So I'll introduce our brilliant speaker. So we're very, very lucky to have freaking floors above us. And we're very lucky to have Bruce Western here today, Professor Western. So he's the director of the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and the professor of sociology at Harvard University. He's also the co-founder of between political institutions and social and economic inequality. He has interests in criminal justice policy, incarceration, and the effects of incarceration on poor communities. With no further ado, Bruce, thank you.
Excellent. Well, thanks everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today, and I totally love the idea of the Civic series, and in some of the work that we're doing at the Kennedy School, I'm very interested in figuring out how we can communicate research better to all different publics around Boston, around the state, and around the country. And I'm very grateful to be invited here today to participate in this series. So the topic today I thought I'd talk about is not the criminal justice system in its entirety, but I thought I would speak specifically about incarceration in America, and this is a topic I've been working on over the last 15, 20 years really, and over the past 40 years we've really passed through quite a fundamental experiment in criminal punishment in the United States. And long-standing principles of rehabilitation and proportionality in sentencing and individualized treatment were significantly abandoned, and they were replaced by principles of retribution and deterrence and incapacitation. And I'll talk more about what I mean by all those things. And the main effect of this revolution in criminal justice policy was the fivefold growth in the scale of prisons and jails in America. And sociologists have called this system mass incarceration. And it represents a new chapter, not just in how we've responded to the problem of crime, but the institutional landscape of American poverty has also quite fundamentally been transformed. And so today I want to do three things. I'd like to talk about some research I've been doing over the last 15 years to try and understand the scope and the consequences of incarceration in America. And second, I'd like to talk a little bit about some new work we've been doing around the Boston area, talking to people who are coming out of prison and returning to communities around Boston. And third, I'd like to explore what's a very pressing policy question. How do we make change in this system of criminal punishment in the United States, and what change in perspective or change in values might be necessary for reform? Now, you might be asking yourselves, how does an Australian sociologist come to be working on problems of American poverty and incarceration? Well, Australia was a penal colony, and real Australian aristocrats have some convicts in their ancestry. So maybe that's the connection. It's a good guess, but my family ties, some of them anyway, don't run nearly as deep as that. My mum came to Australia as a student from Thailand, and that was in the early 1950s. And that was the time of what was called the White Australia policy, and that prohibited anything but European immigration to Australia. And so she wasn't really a member of a minority group because there wasn't any real group for her to speak of. It was just her and a few other foreign students, all of whom were expected to leave the country after they finished their studies. But my mum met my dad, and he wasn't going to Bangkok. And so they stayed in Australia. Now, Australia of the 1960s and 1970s was not an easy place for a young Asian woman. And my mum encountered a lot of racism, some of which we heard about as kids, but most of which I tend to think we didn't. And for all her adult life, really, she was an outsider in that country. Now, my mum is an old, law-abiding Asian woman. What does this have to do with mass incarceration in America today? Well, incarceration is all about outsiders. And if you weren't an outsider before you went to prison, then you became one at the first moment of intake. And from my mum's perspective, a lot of life then becomes about struggling for agency and dignity and a righteous place in the world. Okay, so mass incarceration. What does this mean? Here are some basic facts. The United States is the world record holder when it comes to imprisonment. You measure the size of the penal system in a country with an incarceration rate. And this describes the fraction of people on a given day who are locked up in a correctional facility, a prison or a jail. In Western Europe, the incarceration rate today is about 100 per 100,000. That's about 0.1% of the population behind bars. And that's been pretty stable for a long time. Incarceration's gone up a bit in some Western European countries and it's gone down in others. So 100 per 100,000 in Western Europe. In the United States, the number is 700 per 100,000. So we're 7 times larger than Western Europe. And our closest competitors are Russia, Rwanda, Ukraine, and the Republic of Georgia. But our prison populations even exceed those countries on a per capita basis. The United States accounts for about 5% of the world's population, but about 25% of its prisons. Now, historically, the US was not so different from the international standard. For about 5 decades, from 1925 through the early 1970s, the US imprisonment rate was around about 100 per 100,000, what we see in Western Europe today. But in the early 1970s, our prisons and jails began to grow, and they grew for the next 40 years. What does this mean in terms of numbers? We've now got about 1.5 million people in state prisons, so these are people who were serving a minimum of 12 months for a felony conviction, and at the median, about 28 months of time served in a state or federal facility. We've got another 700,000 people who are either awaiting trial or serving short sentences in county jails. That's not the whole correctional population, because there are another 800,000 people who are on parole, and so they're under the supervision of a parole officer out in the community. And then there are another 4 million people who are currently on probation, and they're people who are serving a suspended sentence, a non-custodial sentence, and reporting to a probation officer out in the community.
Do they count towards the, which of those count towards the incarceration rate?
So the only incarcerated there are people in state and federal prison and in county jails, local jails. So the total incarcerated population is about 2.1 million now, but you add up the total correctional population, it's about 7 million once you count people on parole and on probation. That's entirely historically novel. That level of correctional supervision has only emerged in the last 10 years. Now, a lot of research on incarceration has studied its effects on crime. The National Research Council just concluded a review of its research on crime and other research in its report on the growth of incarceration in the United States. And the NRC report, the National Research Council report, reviews arguments about the incapacitative and deterrent effects of prison time. And it summarises a lot of the empirical evidence. So incarceration is thought to reduce crime by deterring people or by incapacitation, by locking up those who would otherwise be committing crime in free society. And a large number of studies, there's big research literature trying to figure out the effects of incarceration on crime. How much does incapacity? Many studies have been conducted that try to estimate the reduction in crime that has resulted from this very large increase in incarceration from 100 per 100,000 to 700 per 100,000 over the last 40 years. Estimates of the crime-reducing effects of incarceration vary a lot, but many of these studies find the effects to be quite small. And what does small mean? It means that a 1% increase in incarceration yields a 0.1% decline in crime. There isn't a lot of scientific consensus about the magnitude of the effect of incarceration on crime. Relevant research looked not at the overall incarceration rate, but specific policy measures. So what can we say about specific policies? And a lot of the best research here looks at long sentences. And long sentences are important because they're one of the things that really set the United States apart from Western Europe, for example. So in the United States, there are now about 150,000 people serving so-called LWOP sentences, life without parole sentences. 150,000 in the United States. In Western Europe, the number serving life without parole sentences is 12. And so, so the life without parole sentence isn't consistent. Human rights extra 20 years of time served on your sentence. Long sentences were found to have very little incapacitative effect because they have the effect of locking up people who are older, much less criminally active than younger people. So the focus of punishment with long sentences is on those people who are not very criminally active. Penal severity has come to focus on those who no longer present much of a threat to public safety. So there's a lot of uncertainty about how much crime is reduced by incarceration, but we're a lot more confident that long sentences do little to reduce crime, either through deterrence or incapacitation. Now, while overall incarceration rates have been historically high in the last few years, that's not the most important thing about incarceration in America. The most important thing about incarceration in America is its unequal distribution across the population. So here are the facts. Men are 10 times more likely to go to prison than women. African Americans to be in prison as whites, and high school dropouts are about 20 times more likely to go to prison than people who have been to college. So disparities of race and class and gender have produced really extraordinary rates of incarceration, particularly among young African American men, underage of African American men underage out of high school. Among college-educated white men of the same age, the incarceration rate is, what would you guess? So 35% among young black male dropouts. White men of the same age, incarceration rate would be 1%, 2%. 0.1%. It's 0.3 of 1%. So the incarceration rate among black dropouts is 100 times higher, more than 100 times higher actually, than for college-educated white men of the same age. Now it's natural to say, of course, that those young African-American men who failed at school are committing a lot more crime, but 35 years ago, crime rates were much higher than they are today. The homicide rate today is as low as it's been since the early 1960s. It's about where it is at 1961. And the incarceration rate for those young men, 35 years, was much lower than it is today, even though the crime rate was much higher back then.
I was just curious if you had the statistic of white dropout, age 35.
Yeah, really good question. So it's about 8 or 9%. So there's this huge disparity by levels of education, and the average level of schooling of the state nation is about 10.5 years. And so it's a very disadvantaged population, functional level of literacy around 5 or 6, grade 5 or 6. Now, we can think about these risks of incarceration another way. We can ask, well, what's the likelihood someone's ever going to serve time in prison at some point in their lives, a cumulative risk of imprisonment? And we might think about imprisonment that way because we might think that serving time that affects a whole array of life chances even after you've been released. So how large is the group that's at risk of these adverse life chances? So we looked at a birth cohort of African American men who were born in the late 1940s. And these are men growing up before the prison boom, and they're reaching their mid-30s in the late 1970s. And so for that birth cohort of African American men, we estimated that 11% time in prison at some point in their lives. So black men growing up, born in the late 1940s. Now we compared that birth cohort to another birth cohort born in the late 1970s. And this is a group of men who are reaching their 40s right now. So they're growing up through the period of the American prison boom. And we estimate that in that birth cohort, about 25% of African American men will serve prison at some point in their lives. For that birth cohort, African American men are far more likely to serve time in state or federal prison than they are to finish college with a 4-year degree. If they dropped out of high school, the cumulative risk of imprisonment, the lifetime risk of imprisonment, is about 70%. So serving time in prison has become a normal life event for African American men with levels of schooling. Now, the incarceration rate today is so high for one reason only, and it's because we as a society have chosen the prison to mark the occasion of criminal offending. It's been a very fundamental change in criminal justice policy. The ubiquity of penal confinement in the lives of young black men is historically new. It's only emerged in the last decade. But this is only half the story in understanding the significance of mass incarceration. The other half of the story concerns the effects of incarceration on social and economic inequality. And this is where a lot of my research has been over the last 10 years. The inequalities produced by contemporary patterns of incarceration have 3 distinctive characteristics which make them very intractable and a very challenging problem for policy reform. The inequalities of incarceration are invisible to our usual accounting of the economic well-being of the population. They're cumulative, so they tend to deepen the disadvantage of a segment of the population that's already very disadvantaged to begin with. And the inequality is intergenerational, transmitting the penalties of a prison record. A little bit of work on each of these ideas: invisible inequality, cumulative inequality, and intergenerational inequality. Invisible inequality first. The inequality created by incarceration is often invisible to many because the incarcerated population is disconnected from the basic institutions, households and the labour market, which are woven into our understanding and measurement of the population. Here's a very simple illustration. We often measure the economic well-being of the population with an employment to population ratio. And this takes a number of people employed as a ratio of the whole population. And typically we measure this with the Current Population Survey. The Current Population Survey is a monthly labour force survey run by the census. It's used to measure the unemployment rate and a whole variety of measures of economic well-being. The Current Population Survey is a household survey. So you only count if you live in a household. Now, for the general population, it's totally fine. But for small groups that are highly institutionalised, the Current Population Survey significantly mismeasures economic well-being. The CPS says 45% of black male dropouts under 35 are working. 45% are working. But the true number is 25% once you take account of the large number of people who are locked up in prison and jail. So when you count the economic status for incarcerated, the 60s that eliminated, for example, formal discrimination. Okay, that's invisible inequality. Cumulative inequality is next. The negative social and economic effects of incarceration are concentrated on those who are already acutely disadvantaged to begin with. So how does incarceration produce these negative social and economic effects? Well, serving time in prison creates a stigma. Employers don't want to hire you, for example. In many cases, prison undermines skills. The kinds of behaviour that help you survive inside can hurt you in your dealings with co-workers or the general public in free society. The research evidence is strongest for the stigma of a criminal record. And to see the effects of criminal stigma in New York City, and this with my my collaborator Diva Pager at the Kennedy School. And in this study, we sent out job applicants who applied for over 1,000 entry-level jobs in New York City. And these were fake job applicants. These were people who were specially trained. They dressed similarly. They were trained to respond similarly in job interviews. And in these audit studies of employment, you call these fake job applicants testers. And these testers were sent out in pairs. And they applied for jobs, and they had resumes that they would use in these job applications. Resumes were identical in all respects except one. One in each pair would present evidence of a criminal record. So a parole officer was listed as a reference and listed in a correctional facility. The findings showed that a black man with a prison record would have to search for work for nearly 3 times as long as a black man with a clean record to find employment. For white job applicants, the effects were still very large and significant, but a little bit smaller. Other analysis of survey data shows that serving time in prison reduces annual employment by about 15%, reduces annual earnings by about 40%. So that's cumulative inequality.
So when you were saying about the difference between black and white people who are applying the same jobs,
Yeah. The successful callback rate of people with criminal records among the black job applicants was only about 1/3 as high as people with clean records. Among the white applicants, it was only. So that's the difference. Another interesting finding from that study showed that there was also significance of racial discrimination in the labour market in our New York City study, and in fact, an African American man with a clean record had about as much success as a white job applicant with a criminal record in the New York City study. Okay, last thing, intergenerational means lots of kids currently have a parent currently in prison or jail. If we think again about cumulative risks, we can estimate for children see a parent sent to prison. For African American kids born in 1990, nearly a quarter had experienced the imprisonment of a parent by their 14th birthday. The research shows that when a parent goes to prison, the kids do poorly. They do poorly financially, and the kids present a range of problems from depressive symptoms to aggressive behaviour and diminished school achievement. We're coming to learn there's a very active area of research now. We're coming to learn that these problems are most serious with boys. Inherited trait. We were interviewing a mother, Linda, this was last October, and she was telling us about her 3 children and their 2 fathers. And Linda told me that the father of her middle child was her soulmate, her lifelong partner. When I got back to the office later that day, I realised that Linda's middle child was also in the study. Was incarcerated at the same women prison as her mother. And the child reported was that her father, and this was Linda's soulmate, was unknown to her and had played no real role in her life. And the child, like her two siblings, was legally adopted by her grandmother at birth. Her father was locked up for much of her own life, and he's currently serving a long sentence in state prison in Massachusetts. Only since mother and daughter have been released, they started to develop a relationship now. Linda was in and out. She was largely a stranger to her daughter and mostly a source of chaos and conflict when she was at home. But the only solution we really had for mother or daughter was the criminal justice system, and Linda's problems became so 2 generations of very extreme economic insecurity, homelessness, drug addiction, and the notable absence of men as any source of stability or material support. But for all that, Linda's now been clean a year. She's stably housed, and she desperately wants a relationship with her kids. And she doesn't. She told us because she was too bad, and her mother took her in. So for her, getting clean and getting housed has allowed her to begin to be a mother to her children. And so here's an opportunity for policy intervention, getting clean, getting housed. Maybe this is opens the possibility for public policy without the intervention of the criminal justice system. We have the courts and prisons to do this. So that's invisible, cumulative, and intergenerational inequality. What does it mean? In my view, the redrawing of social inequality by mass incarceration really amounts to a contraction of citizenship, a contraction of the population that enjoys in what T.H. Marshall, the British sociologist, called full membership in society. Citizenship in America has become smaller as the prison population has become larger, largely through the effects of invisible, cumulative, and intergenerational inequality. And what's more, I think we're threatened now with a deep gap in legitimacy. The police, the courts, and the prisons have significantly lost the confidence of the poor and minority communities that they're regulating so intensively. And police-community relations are adversarial, and the institutions that are charged with maintaining safety and order are viewed with a lot of suspicion. And I think we've seen a very, very vivid representation of this with the events in Ferguson over the last 2 weeks in Missouri. So these for me are elements of a vicious circle. We've got deeper and invisible inequalities combined with a widening legitimacy gap between the poor and the mainstream of American society. Incarceration really difficult to change. So this was sort of as far as my research took me until, say, 2008. And then it became a very urgent policy question for me. How can this vicious circle that I was observing in my research in the middle of a very, very active policy reform conversation, really for the first time in 40 years in criminal justice policy in America. So how can this vicious circle be broken? How can full citizenship be promoted for everyone in American society? Now, at this point, I could talk to you about the specifics of sentencing reform and diversion programs that try and keep people out of prison, and prisoner reentry that help people adjust to society after they're released from incarceration. And the National Research Council incarceration report goes into this in great detail. But I think fundamentally, the expansion of citizenship is really an act of political imagination. And the outsiders of American society in the political conversation have to be reconceived as insiders. And I think fundamentally for this to happen, the insiders of American society that dominate so much of the political conversation have to see something in the citizens to be. This is the political process that has to go on, I think, that will reinflate, expand citizenship to include those at the margins. April 2012, a research team at Harvard began a series of interviews with 135 men and women who were leaving prison. One of my first interviews was at a minimum security prison with Peter. Peter's an African-American man in his late 40s. He'd spent most of the last 15 years in prison. He'd had a long history of violence that was episodically associated with drinking, and throughout his life he had dealt drugs, stolen cars, and got in fights. Over the following year after his release, we saw in detail a lot of the challenges confronting people who leave prison. In his first week out, Peter applied to a community program for work clothes and a mass transit card. At first, he divided his time between a friend's place and his older sister's crowded house that also housed her fiancée, her daughter, and her granddaughter. Over months, Peter began to develop a relationship with two of his three kids and their two mothers. He was closer to one mother and her child than another, and he seemed to have focused more attention on his 10-year-old son, though he did what he could to buy both his kids clothes and school supplies. Peter was enrolled in food stamps and Mass Health, Massachusetts Medicaid program, and each month he gave his $200 in food stamps to his sister where he was staying, though his food stamps has now expired and he's hoping to be reinstated. Through Mass Health, he's attended mental health and substance abuse treatment, and he's also had a physical and visited the dentist. Peter couldn't find work, but he enrolled in employment programs doing maintenance and operating machines. The programs paid less than minimum wage, but he thought it was really important to get into a daily routine. And for 6 months in the work program, he'd get up at 5 a.m., he'd be ready to start at 6:30, and he'd work through to 3 p.m. Every 2 weeks, he'd report to his probation officer, and at weekends, he'd do community service. And this was in lieu of his $65 a month probation fee. Peter gets from place to place by mass transit and walking, and he's worried that if he rides in a car with friends, he might get arrested. If the car's stopped by police, his probation status might come up, and this might trigger a violation if others in the car have felony convictions or if drugs or guns are discovered. Peter couldn't find work initially because he told us of his criminal record. Now at age 47, he's working for the minimum wage, $8.50 in Massachusetts, and he's at a laundry. He's been at that job for about 6 months now. With more interviews and phone calls, we learned a little of Peter's family history. He grew up in the Lennox Street Projects, which is a public housing complex in South End. He was a runaway as a kid. Around the age of 12, he would leave the house for weeks at a time. He was living with friends, often drinking, using drugs, getting in trouble. One of his earliest memories of serious violence was of a brawl between blacks and whites outside an Irish bar in Mattapan. He and his uncle were involved in the fight, and in that melee, Peter saw a white man stabbed to death just outside the diner where we talked over 30 years later. And Peter was 12 at the time when that murder occurred. So mass incarceration looks a lot like this. It's not just a burgeoning prison population and the statistics of confinement, but it's how American poverty has come to be lived. The poor don't just live below an income threshold. Low income accompanies the tightly correlated adversity of violence and addiction and mental illness and childhood trauma and school failure and labour market discrimination, housing instability and family complexity. And on top of all of this, we've overlaid lengthy periods of penal confinement. So overcoming mass incarceration depends a lot on how much the insiders of American society see of themselves in Peter. Can we imagine a citizenry that includes Peter as much as it includes the rest of us? Now, if Peter's life circumstances are unfamiliar, he shares in a history that's thoroughly recognisable. The Leonard Street projects in Boston are one of the many the context for US race relations over the last half century. His daily struggle to make ends meet and provide for his kids are basic human challenges that are the American middle class. Of course, the likelihood and consequences of failure for Peter are much greater, but the struggle is familiar. So maybe his place in the shared history and the effort he makes to find a righteous place in the world can close the social distance enough to help start a different conversation about prisons and crime and American poverty. But building such a conversation, I think, requires a detailed understanding of poverty as it's actually lived. And here we have to acknowledge all of the agency and the effort and creativity of those engulfed in the penal system, just as we emphasise the weighting constraint of social forces. So Peter's sold drugs, he's been on both sides of serious violence, and he's been locked up for most of his adult life. But for all that, he gets up at 5 in the morning, goes to programs, he meets his son after school. He says that street life is well behind him, but the future is very difficult to predict for poor men with long criminal histories. So could he once again wave a gun in someone's face, or abandon his children, or relapse to addiction? Sure. And a good part of Peter's humanity rests. That's how big I think our compassion is going to find a way out. Just as we entertain the possibility and hope that people can change, we equally recognise that people can fail, and sometimes fail spectacularly. And indeed, that's, for me, that's what's fundamentally human about someone like Peter and all of the other people that are struggling with the challenge of leaving prison. The fact that he might fail should be the source of our compassion and the basis of history. That's my view. I want to show a short video of Peter, and he's telling the story. Let me see. He's telling the story. I hope you can hear it. I'm going to play the audio just off my computer, but I'll turn the volume right up. So, the story of driving from Boston to New York. Waiting for a bus on his way home from school.
was taking my son to New York, my youngest son to New York, to get him a suit to go to his brother's funeral. And my mother called me because she had found out what happened. I cried all the way to New York. My son was in the back seat sleeping. I could see that he was going through it mentally. He was going through it mentally. I asked my mother, I told my mother, I said, Mom, I changed my campus. She was like, who? I was like, God, I changed my life to see shake campus. She was like, yeah. She said, yeah, just trust and believe and take care of it. So, made a decision to change my life. Take care of us. Yeah. Take care of us.
And one of them, told me about a colleague of his at his